Back in 2002, in a peaceful suburb in Ohio, a young girl suddenly vanished and authorities were left with nothing. More than 11 years later, one small detail reopened the case, and it revealed something no one expected. The town of Grove City, Ohio, was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. It was a close-knit community filled with two-story suburban houses, neatly trimmed lawns, and wide sidewalks where children played until the streetlights came on. People knew their neighbors. They waved to each other in the mornings and left their front doors unlocked during the day. It was a safe place, a quiet place, a place where families moved to build a good life far away from the dangers of the busy city. But something didn't feel right. There was an invisible shadow hanging over one particular house at the end of Elm Street, though no one could see it yet. What happened next shocked everyone. Sarah and David were a hardworking middle-class family. Sarah worked as a nurse at the local clinic, spending her days caring for others, while David managed accounts at a nearby bank. They had worked hard to buy their home, a modest house with a large backyard enclosed by a tall wooden fence. They were proud of the life they had built. But their greatest joy, the center of their entire world, was their 5-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma was a bright, energetic little girl with a head of curly blonde hair and a laugh that could brighten the darkest room. She loved drawing pictures of animals, playing hide-and-seek, and carrying around a worn-out stuffed rabbit named Barnaby. She took that rabbit everywhere. It was her best friend. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Their daily routine was simple and comforting. Every morning, Sarah would wake up early to make breakfast. The smell of pancakes and coffee would fill the small kitchen. David would sit at the table reading the local newspaper, and Emma would sit in her booster seat, happily eating while watching morning cartoons. It was a picture of a perfect, quiet life. They spent their weekends taking long walks in the neighborhood park, visiting the local grocery store, and working in the garden. They had no enemies. They had no dark secrets. They were just an ordinary American family living an ordinary life. But something about the situation seemed unusual, even if they didn't know it yet. That's when everything started to change. It was a crisp Saturday morning in October. The leaves on the trees had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and there was a slight chill in the air. Sarah had the weekend off, and she was looking forward to spending a quiet day at home. David had gone to the local hardware store to pick up some supplies for a home repair project. It was just Sarah and Emma in the house. The morning passed peacefully. Emma sat on the living room floor, coloring in her favorite book, while Sarah cleaned the kitchen. The television played softly in the background. It felt like any other weekend, but the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. Around noon, the sun came out, warming the chilly autumn air. Emma asked if she could go play in the backyard. Sarah looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was fully fenced, the gate was locked, and the neighborhood was completely silent. It was a safe space. Sarah smiled and told her she could go out, but she had to stay near the patio. Emma grabbed her stuffed rabbit Barnaby and ran out the back door, her little shoes tapping against the wooden deck. Sarah watched her for a moment through the glass, feeling a deep sense of love and contentment. She watched her daughter sit on the grass, talking to her toy rabbit and picking fallen leaves, but something was wrong, really wrong. And then things got even stranger. Sarah realized she had left a load of laundry in the washing machine upstairs. She figured it would only take her 2 minutes to move the clothes to the dryer. She opened the back door and called out to Emma, telling her she was going upstairs for just a second and to stay right where she was. Emma nodded, not looking up from her game in the grass. Sarah left the door open just a crack so she could hear if Emma called for her. She walked up the stairs, quickly moved the wet clothes into the dryer and folded a few towels. It took exactly 3 minutes, maybe less. She didn't hear a sound. The house was completely silent. No one knew what was about to unfold. Sarah came back downstairs and walked into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and looked out the window to check on Emma, but the yard was empty. Sarah froze. She set the glass down on the counter and stepped closer to the glass. She looked toward the large oak tree, thinking maybe Emma was hiding behind it, but there was no sign of her. A chill ran down her spine. She told herself not to panic. Emma was probably just playing a game of hide-and-seek. She opened the back door and stepped out onto the patio. The autumn air suddenly felt much colder, but what really happened was hard to accept. That's when the situation became more serious. "Emma," Sarah called out, her voice echoed slightly in the quiet yard. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling the dead leaves. Sarah walked down the steps and stepped onto the grass. She checked behind the large bushes. She checked inside the small plastic playhouse in the corner of the yard. It was empty. Her heart began to beat faster. She walked toward the back of the yard where the wooden fence separated their property from a narrow walking path. That was when she noticed it. The wooden gate, which was always securely latched, was open. Just an inch, but it was open. Her heart sank. She couldn't believe it. But something about that moment stayed with her forever. What she saw next made her freeze. Lying on the ground just outside the open gate was Barnaby, the worn-out stuffed rabbit. Emma never went anywhere without it. She would never just drop it in the dirt and walk away. Sarah dropped to her knees and picked up the toy. It was slightly damp from the autumn ground. She stared at it, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It didn't make sense, it just didn't. She ran out into the walking path, looking left and right. The path was empty. There was no one in sight. No neighbors, no dog walkers, nothing. And then something completely unexpected occurred. No one realized what was coming. Panic completely took over. Sarah began running down the path, screaming Emma's name at the top of her lungs. Tears filled her eyes, blurring her vision. She ran to the street, knocking on the doors of her neighbors. Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who lived next door, opened her door with a confused look. Sarah begged her, crying hysterically, asking if she had seen Emma. Mrs. Gable shook her head, her face turning pale. She hadn't seen anyone, no one had. Sarah pulled her cell phone from her pocket with trembling hands and dialed David's number. He answered on the second ring, cheerful and relaxed, completely unaware that their lives were about to shatter. But there was one detail no one could explain. That's when things took a dark turn. "David, she's gone," Sarah screamed into the phone, her voice breaking. "Emma is gone. She was in the backyard and now she's gone." David dropped his supplies right in the middle of the hardware store and ran to his car. He drove recklessly through the quiet suburban streets, breaking every speed limit, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he pulled into their driveway, the police were already there. Two squad cars were parked out front with their lights flashing, casting eerie red and blue reflections against the quiet houses. Sarah was sitting on the front porch steps, clutching the dirty stuffed rabbit to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. David ran to her, falling to his knees and wrapping his arms around her. He felt something was wrong. Deep down, he knew this wasn't a simple case of a child wandering off, but the real story was much worse. What they discovered next was hard to believe. Within an hour, the quiet neighborhood was transformed into a massive search grid. Dozens of police officers arrived, setting up yellow crime scene tape around the house and the backyard. Detectives in dark suits began knocking on every single door on Elm Street, questioning everyone. They asked if anyone had seen a stranger, if anyone had noticed a strange car parked on the street, if anyone had heard a child crying. The answers were all the same. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. It was the middle of the day in a crowded neighborhood, yet a 5-year-old girl had simply vanished into thin air. But something wasn't adding up. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Detective James, a seasoned investigator with graying hair and tired eyes, took charge of the case. He had worked missing persons cases for over 20 years, but something about this one bothered him deeply. He stood in the backyard, looking at the open gate and the walking path beyond it. There were no footprints in the soft mud. There were no signs of a struggle. The fence wasn't broken. It was as if someone had simply opened the gate, picked the child up, and walked away without making a single sound. He interviewed Sarah and David separately, a standard procedure, but their immense grief was clear and undeniable. They had nothing to do with this. Someone had taken their daughter, but the reality was more complicated than it seemed. And then the mystery deepened. By nightfall, the search had expanded drastically. Search and rescue dogs were brought in. The dogs picked up Emma's scent near the back gate, followed it down the walking path for about 50 yards, and then stopped right at the edge of the main road. The scent just ended. The handlers explained that this usually meant the person had entered a vehicle. A helicopter with thermal imaging flew over the nearby woods, scanning the dark trees for any sign of a small heat signature. Volunteers from the community gathered with flashlights, forming long lines and walking through the dense brush, calling her name into the cold night. The whole town came together, desperate to find the little girl. But something about the investigation felt different that night. What they uncovered changed everything. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. The local news stations broadcasted Emma's picture every single hour. Her smiling face with her curly blonde hair and bright eyes was printed on thousands of flyers and taped to every telephone pole, grocery store window, and gas station pump in the county. The community held candlelight vigils at the local church, praying for her safe return. The police set up a dedicated tip line, receiving hundreds of calls. People reported seeing a girl matching her description in a mall 3 towns over or at a diner on the highway. Detectives chased down every single lead. They reviewed hours and hours of grainy security camera footage from local businesses, but every lead turned out to be a dead end. Every sighting was just another little girl with blonde hair, but the truth had been hidden all along. That's when the truth slowly began to surface. The failure of the investigation began to take a heavy toll on Sarah and David. Their home, once filled with laughter and warmth, turned into a silent tomb. Emma's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it. Her bed was made, her favorite storybooks were stacked on the nightstand, and her clothes still hung in the closet. Sarah would spend hours sitting on the floor of that room, just staring at the walls, holding Barnaby the rabbit. She stopped going to work. She stopped eating. The guilt consumed her completely. She replayed those 3 minutes in her head over and over again. If she had just waited to do the laundry, if she had just brought Emma inside with her, if she had just looked out the window 1 second sooner. The pain was unbearable. She was terrified, but there was something strange about it all. And then something unusual caught her attention. Months passed and the snow began to fall, burying the town in a thick, cold blanket of white. The volunteer searches slowly stopped. The news stations moved on to other, fresher stories. The yellow police tape around their house was eventually taken down. Detective James still called them once a week to check in, but his voice lacked the confident energy it once had. He was running out of options. The police had interviewed known criminals in the area, checked local sex offender registries, and even looked into distant family members. Nothing. The case was slowly growing cold. The cruel reality was settling in. Whoever took Emma was very careful and they had gotten away with it. But what was hidden shocked everyone. No one imagined how this would end. David tried to hold the family together. He forced himself to go back to work at the bank, though his mind was never really there. He tried to get Sarah to leave the house to take small walks to go to therapy. But the trauma had broken something fundamental inside their marriage. They stopped talking. The silence in the house became a wall between them. They were both drowning in the same sorrow, but they couldn't save each other. When a year passed, they held a small gathering to mark the anniversary of her disappearance. Very few people showed up. The town wanted to forget the tragedy. It made them uncomfortable to remember that a monster could walk into their safe neighborhood in broad daylight and take a child. But something didn't make sense. What they found later was far worse than they imagined. Years went by with no answers. Time passed and hope faded. 2 years turned into 5. 5 years turned into 10. The flyers on the telephone poles eventually faded in the sun and were torn away by the wind. The small suburban house on Elm Street grew older, the paint peeling slightly, the garden overgrown. Sarah and David remained in the house, unable to move away. Leaving the house felt like giving up completely. If Emma ever somehow found her way back, they needed to be there. They needed to be waiting, but the house felt like a museum of their grief. Emma would have been 15 years old now, a teenager. Sarah sometimes wondered what she would look like if her hair was still curly, what her voice would sound like. It hurt to think about it, but it hurt even more to try and forget. But deep down, she knew something was off. That's when everything became clear. By the 11th year, the case of Emma's disappearance was officially classified as a cold case. It sat in a dusty box in the basement of the police station. Detective James had retired, moving to Florida to live out his quiet years, though he admitted to David that Emma's face still haunted his dreams. A new, younger detective had taken over the desk, but he rarely looked at the old files. The world had completely moved on. Sarah and David were now in their late 40s, carrying a heavy sadness in their eyes that never went away. They lived like ghosts in their own lives, moving through the motions of work, sleep, and silence. They had accepted that they would probably die without ever knowing what happened to their little girl. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. And then something happened that no one could ignore. It was a bitterly cold night in November, exactly 11 years and 2 months since the day Emma vanished. The wind howled outside the suburban house, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves scraping across the driveway. It was past midnight. The street was completely dark and empty. Inside, the house was silent. David was asleep in the master bedroom, his breathing slow and heavy. Sarah was awake. She suffered from terrible insomnia, a permanent gift from the day her daughter disappeared. She sat in the living room chair, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the dark television screen. The only light came from the small lamp in the corner. It was an ordinary, quiet, agonizingly slow night. No one knew what was about to unfold, but something felt different that night. What happened after that was even more disturbing. Suddenly, the sharp, shrill sound of the telephone shattered the heavy silence of the house. It was exactly 2 in the morning. Sarah jumped in her chair, her heart instantly pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sudden noise was deafening in the quiet living room. She stared at the old landline phone sitting on the kitchen counter, its bright red light flashing in the darkness. Nobody ever called the landline anymore, especially not at this hour of the night. Her first thought was that it had to be a wrong number, just a careless mistake by a stranger, but something about the situation seemed unusual. She slowly stood up, wrapping the warm blanket tightly around her shoulders, and walked toward the kitchen. The phone rang for a second time, the sound echoing off the bare walls of the house. She reached out with a trembling hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before picking up the receiver. She pressed the cold plastic to her ear and softly said hello into the darkness. At first, there was only the hollow, scratching sound of static on the line, but what she heard next would change everything. Through the heavy static, she could hear the faint sound of uneven breathing. It sounded like someone was trying very hard to stay quiet, but their breath was catching in their throat. Sarah froze, her entire body going entirely numb. She asked who was there, her voice barely more than a terrified whisper. The breathing hitched and then a voice spoke. It was a young woman's voice, trembling and quiet, barely louder than the static on the line. "Mom," the voice whispered, the word breaking with emotion. "It's me. I still have Barnaby." And then, with a sharp click, the line went completely dead. Sarah stood there in the dark kitchen, the dial tone blaring loudly in her ear, completely unable to process what had just happened. But deep down, she knew something was off. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The phone slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the hard kitchen floor, the plastic casing cracking violently upon impact. Sarah fell to her knees, a raw, painful scream tearing out of her throat. It wasn't just a cry of shock, it was the sound of 11 years of buried agony suddenly exploding out of her chest. David woke up instantly, his feet hitting the bedroom floor before his eyes were even fully open. He sprinted down the dark hallway and practically fell down the stairs, terrified that someone had broken into the house. He found Sarah on the kitchen floor, clutching her chest and gasping for air, pointing shakingly at the broken telephone. He dropped beside her, grabbing her shoulders and begging her to tell him what was wrong. She could barely speak through her violent sobbing, but she managed to choke out the words, the voice, the name Barnaby, but the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. That's when the situation became more serious. David's face lost all its color in an instant. The stuffed rabbit, that detail had never been released to the public. When Emma disappeared 11 years ago, the police had deliberately kept the discovery of the dirty stuffed toy near the back gate a secret. They called it holdback evidence, a way to weed out false confessions and fake tips. Only the police, Sarah, and David knew about Barnaby. Whoever was on the other end of that phone call either knew exactly what happened to their daughter or it was actually her. David scrambled to pick up the broken pieces of the phone, managing to piece it back together just enough to get a dial tone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely press the buttons. He dialed the emergency code to trace the last incoming call, praying that the automated voice would give him a number. But something wasn't adding up. What happened after that was even more disturbing. The automated system coldly informed him that the caller's number was restricted and could not be provided. Frustration and pure panic surged through David's veins. He immediately dialed 911, screaming at the dispatcher to send police to their house right away, explaining that his missing daughter had just called them. The dispatcher, sensing the absolute desperation in his voice, promised to send an officer immediately. Within 10 minutes, the familiar, terrifying glow of red and blue police lights washed over the front of the house on Elm Street once again. It felt like a nightmare repeating itself, pulling them right back into the worst day of their entire lives. Two patrol officers rushed through the front door, finding Sarah and David sitting on the floor, clinging to each other in sheer terror. But there was one detail no one could explain. No one expected what happened after that. A short time later, a plainclothes detective arrived at the house. His name was Detective Miller. He was much younger than the original investigator, having only been promoted to the detective division a few years ago. He was sharp, highly observant, and familiar with the infamous cold case that had haunted the town for over a decade. When he walked into the kitchen, he saw the broken phone and the utterly destroyed parents, and he immediately knew this wasn't a cruel prank. He sat down with them, his voice calm and steady, and asked Sarah to repeat exactly what she had heard, word for word. Sarah repeated the short, terrifying phrase over and over again, her eyes wide and unblinking. Miller wrote everything down in a small notebook, his expression growing extremely serious. What they found next was hard to believe, and then things got even stranger. Detective Miller explained that because the call came through an older landline infrastructure, tracing a restricted number wouldn't be as fast as tracking a modern cell phone. He had to wake up a local judge in the middle of the night to sign an emergency subpoena, demanding that the telecom company release the routing data for the incoming call. The hours that followed were absolute torture for Sarah and David. They sat on the living room sofa, staring blankly at the wall as the clock slowly ticked toward morning. 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. The sun began to rise, casting long, pale shadows across the quiet suburban street. Every single minute felt like an entire lifetime. Detective Miller paced back and forth in the kitchen, constantly checking his phone, waiting for the telecom supervisor to call him back with the location data. But something about the investigation felt different that night. That's when the mystery deepened. Finally, just as the morning light fully illuminated the living room, Miller's phone rang. He snatched it off the counter and spoke in rapid, hushed tones for about 2 minutes. Sarah and David held their breath, their eyes locked firmly on his face, trying to read his expression. When Miller hung up, he looked at them with a completely unreadable expression. He told them they had a location. The call hadn't come from a hidden basement or a secret burner phone. It had been made from a public payphone. The location was roughly 40 miles away, out on a forgotten stretch of rural highway known as Route 9. It was an area surrounded by dense woods and old, abandoned farmland. It wasn't exactly close, but it wasn't far away either. Whoever made that call was right in their own backyard, but the reality was even darker than they thought. What they uncovered changed everything. Miller promised Sarah and David that he would go out there himself immediately. He told them to stay at the house, to keep the phone line clear, and to lock all the doors. He left the house quickly, getting into his unmarked police vehicle and speeding out of the quiet neighborhood. The drive out to Route 9 took nearly an hour. As he drove further away from the city, the landscape changed drastically. The neatly paved roads turned into cracked asphalt, and the suburban houses were replaced by miles of empty fields and thick, dark forests. The area was deeply isolated. There were barely any other cars on the road. It was the kind of place where someone could easily hide from the rest of the world for a very long time. But deep down, he knew something was off. That's when the truth slowly began to surface. He finally pulled up to the location provided by the telecom company. It was an old, rundown diner that looked like it had been permanently closed for at least 20 years. The windows were boarded up with rotting wood, the neon sign on the roof was shattered, and weeds grew thick through the cracks in the parking lot. Standing completely alone near the edge of the lot, illuminated only by the gray morning light, was a rusted metal payphone booth. It looked completely out of place, a relic from a forgotten time. Miller parked his car and stepped out into the freezing autumn air. The silence around the abandoned building was heavy and uncomfortable. He unholstered his flashlight and slowly walked toward the booth, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. But there was something strange about it. What he found next left him speechless. The payphone was covered in years of dirt and graffiti. The heavy metal receiver was hanging loosely by its cord, swaying slightly in the cold wind. Someone had definitely been here a few hours ago. Miller pulled a pair of latex gloves from his pocket and carefully lifted the receiver, placing it back onto the hook so it wouldn't get damaged further. He inspected the keypad, looking for fresh fingerprints or any signs of blood. It was clean. He stepped back and scanned the ground around the booth. The concrete was covered in dead leaves and old cigarette butts. But then, right at the base of the metal pole, something caught his eye. It was a small piece of lined notebook paper folded neatly into a tiny square. It looked entirely completely new. It wasn't wet from the morning dew, meaning it had been dropped very recently. No one expected what happened after that, and then something unusual caught his attention. Miller carefully picked up the small square of paper using a pair of tweezers from his evidence kit. He slowly unfolded it, taking extreme care not to smudge any potential fingerprints. When he saw what was inside, his breath caught in his throat. It was a drawing. It was a simple, rough sketch done in dark blue ink. It was a picture of a rabbit with one floppy ear and a stitched nose. It was Barnaby. The drawing was simple, but it was drawn with a much steadier, more mature hand than the 5-year-old girl who used to sketch on the living room floor. It was a message, it was proof. She was alive, and she had been standing exactly in this spot just a few hours ago. Miller's hands shook slightly as he placed the paper into a clear plastic evidence bag, but something didn't make sense. What they realized next turned everything upside down. If she was alive and she had made it to a public phone, why hadn't she stayed? Why hadn't she called the police instead of her mother? The realization hit him like a physical blow. She must have been running out of time. Someone had caught her, or she knew someone was coming back for her. She had just enough time to dial the number she had memorized as a child, drop the clue, and then she was taken away again. Panic set in. Miller immediately radioed dispatch, calling for all available units in the county to converge on the abandoned diner. Within 20 minutes, the isolated parking lot was swarming with local deputies and state troopers. They brought tracking dogs, hopping to find a trail leading into the dense woods behind the building. The peaceful morning was completely shattered by the sound of sirens and barking dogs, but the real story was much worse. That's when things took a dark turn. The search dogs sniffed the ground around the payphone and immediately caught a scent. They pulled their handlers aggressively toward the edge of the parking lot, heading straight for the cracked asphalt of the highway. But right at the shoulder of the road, the dogs stopped and began to bark in confusion. The scent trail ended abruptly on the side of the road. It was the exact same thing that had happened 11 years ago in the walking path behind Emma's house. She had been put into a vehicle. Miller knelt down on the side of the road, examining the dirt and gravel near the pavement. There, pressed deeply into the soft mud, were a set of fresh tire tracks. They were wide and aggressive, like the tires of a heavy truck or an off-road vehicle. He called over an evidence technician to take plaster molds of the tracks immediately, but the truth behind it was shocking. No one knew what was about to unfold. While the technicians worked on the tire tracks, Miller noticed something else. Across the highway, about a quarter of a mile down the road, there was a small independent gas station. It was the only functioning business in the immediate area. It looked old and dirty, but high up on the corner of the main building, pointing toward the road, was a small black security camera. Miller didn't waste a single second. He jumped back into his car and sped down the road to the gas station. He threw open the glass door, startling the older man standing behind the counter. Miller flashed his badge and demanded to see the security footage from the entire night. The man, looking nervous, led him into a cramped, dusty back office that smelled strongly of old coffee, but something about the situation seemed unusual. What they uncovered was deeply unsettling. The security system was outdated, recording grainy black and white footage directly onto a digital hard drive. Miller sat in the rickety office chair and began scrubbing through the footage, fast-forwarding through hours of absolute darkness and empty road. He watched the timestamp closely, 1:00 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 1:45 a.m. The road remained completely empty. Then at exactly 1:52 a.m., a vehicle appeared at the edge of the screen. It was moving fast, coming down the highway from the opposite direction of town. It suddenly slammed on its brakes, the taillights flaring brightly on the grainy screen, and pulled roughly into the parking lot of the abandoned diner across the street. The camera angle was terrible and the distance made it hard to see clearly, but Miller leaned in until his nose was almost touching the monitor. No one could see what was hidden. And then something completely unexpected occurred. The vehicle was a dark-colored pickup truck with a large, heavy cap over the truck bed. The driver's side door opened, but no one got out. Instead, the passenger door opened. A small, dark figure slipped out of the truck and began running frantically toward the rusted payphone. The figure moved awkwardly, stumbling a bit in the darkness. Miller watched closely as the figure reached the phone booth and stood there for about a minute. Then the driver's side door of the truck flew open. A much larger, taller figure stepped out. The large figure didn't run, it walked slowly and deliberately toward the payphone. The smaller figure dropped the phone, threw something onto the ground, and tried to run toward the woods. But the large figure caught up instantly, grabbing the smaller figure by the arm and dragging them roughly back toward the truck. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. That's when the story shifted completely. Miller's heart pounded violently against his ribs. He was watching a kidnapping in progress. He paused the video and tried to zoom in, but the pixels instantly blurred into an unrecognizable gray mess. He couldn't see faces. He couldn't see a license plate. He hit play again. The large figure forced the smaller one into the passenger side of the truck, slamming the heavy metal door shut. The large figure then walked around to the driver's side, got in, and the truck sped out of the parking lot, heading further down Route 9 into the deep rural countryside. But as the truck accelerated away, the camera picked up one crucial, identifiable detail. The truck's right rear tail light was shattered. When the driver hit the brakes one last time before rounding a curve, the left light glowed a solid red, but the right light flashed a bright, blinding white light through a jagged hole in the red plastic cover. It was a very specific flaw, but something wasn't adding up. What he discovered next would change everything. Miller copied the video file onto a flash drive, thanked the bewildered clerk, and rushed back to his car. He drove directly to the main police precinct, bypassing Elm Street entirely. He needed the full resources of the department immediately. He ran into the building and handed the flash drive to the central dispatch team, ordering them to isolate the frame of the truck and enhance the broken tail light. He then ordered a massive search of the state vehicle registration database for any dark-colored pickup trucks with a heavy bed cap registered in the local Tri-County area. But even as he barked orders, a strange, nagging feeling began to pull at the back of his mind. He walked over to the massive wall of filing cabinets in the basement where the cold cases were kept. He pulled out the heavy cardboard box labeled with Emma's name. But there was something strange about it. That's when the mystery deepened. He dumped the contents of the box out onto a large metal table. Hundreds of yellowing papers, old photographs, and handwritten interview notes spilled everywhere. It was the accumulated failure of the original investigation. Miller started reading through the original neighborhood canvas reports from that cold October day 11 years ago. He was looking for something specific. He didn't know exactly what, but the image of the dark truck with the broken tail light kept flashing in his mind. He read through interviews with neighbors, mail carriers, and delivery drivers. Everyone had sworn they saw nothing unusual. But then, halfway down a stack of dusty papers, he found a single brief report filed by a patrol officer on the third day of the original search. But the reality was more complicated than it seemed. What they found later was far worse than they imagined. The report was extremely brief. An elderly woman who lived 3 streets away from Elm Street had called the tip line to complain about a loud truck that had been parked near her property on the afternoon Emma vanished. She described it as an old, loud, dark-colored pickup truck used by a local lawn care service. The original detective had followed up on the tip. He had interviewed the owner of the small lawn service, a man named Arthur Thomas. Arthur claimed he had been working on a sprinkler system on the opposite side of town all day. He had provided a receipt from a hardware store as his alibi, and the detective had crossed his name off the list. The lead was buried and forgotten. But at the very bottom of the yellowed page, the patrol officer had made a tiny handwritten note about the condition of the man's vehicle when it was briefly inspected. The note read, "Vehicle is poorly maintained. Right rear tail light housing is completely shattered." No one imagined how this would end, and then the truth began to reveal itself. Miller practically sprinted upstairs to his desk, his hands shaking with pure adrenaline. He logged into the current criminal database and searched for the name Arthur Thomas. The computer screen flickered, loading a profile. Arthur Thomas was now 62 years old. He had absolutely no serious criminal record, only a few minor traffic tickets over the years, but he still lived in the same area. In fact, according to his current address on file, he lived on a sprawling, heavily wooded property located exactly 6 miles down Route 9 from the abandoned diner. It was a direct path, everything aligned perfectly. The truck, the location, the timing. The monster hadn't been a stranger passing through on a highway. He had been working right in their neighborhood, entirely invisible in plain sight. But something about it didn't make sense. That's when everything became clear. Miller grabbed his radio and called the tactical response team. He explained the situation quickly, demanding a full armed unit to meet him at the precinct immediately. He then made the hardest phone call of his career. He dialed Sarah and David's home number. David answered on the first ring, his voice raw with exhaustion. Miller told him they had a solid lead. He told them about the truck, the broken tail light, and the connection to a man who had been questioned 11 years ago. He told them they were moving in on the suspect's property right now. He ordered David to stay exactly where he was and keep Sarah calm. David dropped the phone, grabbing Sarah and pulling her tightly against his chest. They didn't speak. They just held onto each other, terrified of what the police were about to find. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. No one realized what was coming. Within 30 minutes, a heavy caravan of unmarked police vehicles and heavily armored tactical trucks left the precinct. They drove with their sirens off, moving silently through the dark rural roads like ghosts. The tension inside Miller's car was suffocating. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw locked. He kept thinking about the drawing of the rabbit. He kept thinking about the terrified voice on the phone. She had survived for 11 years in the darkest hell imaginable. He prayed silently that they weren't too late. They turned off the main highway and onto a long, unpaved dirt road heavily lined with overgrown pine trees. The property was hidden far away from any neighbors or passing cars. It was completely isolated, the perfect place to hide a terrible secret. But what really happened was hard to accept. That's when the situation became more serious. The vehicles came to a slow, quiet stop near a rusted metal gate that blocked the driveway. Two heavily armed officers quietly cut the heavy chain lock with bolt cutters, pushing the squeaking metal gate open just enough for the vehicles to pass through. They drove slowly up the long driveway, the headlights cutting through the thick morning fog. At the end of the dirt path sat a small, incredibly run-down farmhouse. The roof was sagging, the paint was peeling in large strips, and the windows were covered with thick black plastic instead of curtains. The yard was littered with old rusted tools, broken washing machines, and tall weeds. The entire place looked abandoned, decaying, and deeply unsettling. But something didn't feel right. No one was prepared for what came next. Miller stepped out of his car, drawing his service weapon quietly from his holster. The tactical team fanned out, moving silently across the wet grass surrounding the perimeter of the farmhouse. The silence was absolute. There were no lights on inside the house, no smoke coming from the chimney. But as Miller moved toward the front porch, he noticed a large, dark shape parked on the side of the house, partially hidden under a large gray tarp. He signaled to two officers, and they moved cautiously toward the vehicle. One of the officers reached out and grabbed the corner of the heavy tarp, slowly pulling it back. The tarp slipped off the back of the vehicle, revealing a dark, rusted pickup truck bed. And there, staring right back at them in the gray morning light, was the shattered, broken right tail light. It was the exact truck from the gas station camera. It was the exact truck from 11 years ago, but the real story was much worse. What they discovered next left everyone speechless. Before Miller could signal the team to breach the front door of the main house, a sudden noise stopped them all in their tracks. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the backyard. Behind the overgrown bushes and a large pile of rotting firewood, there was a small, detached wooden shed. It looked like an old root cellar, built half into the ground with a heavy wooden door secured by three massive steel padlocks. The noise happened again. It was a faint, muffled thumping sound, like someone kicking against heavy wood from the inside. Then a low, desperate whimpering sound drifted through the cold morning air. The sound chilled Miller to his very bones. The tactical team immediately shifted their focus, rushing past the main house and sprinting toward the half-buried shed in the backyard. But the truth had been hidden all along. And then things took a surprising turn. Miller signaled to the breaching officer, who stepped forward with a heavy set of hydraulic bolt cutters. The metal jaws of the tool clamped down on the first massive padlock. With a sickening loud crunch that seemed to echo through the silent, foggy woods, the lock shattered and fell into the wet grass. The second lock went just as quickly, then the third. The heavy wooden door, swollen with years of moisture and covered in dirt, groaned as the officers pried it open just a few inches. A wave of cold, stagnant, musty air rushed out from the darkness inside, carrying a scent so foul it made the officers step back, gagging. It smelled of decay, unwashed bodies, and old copper. It was the smell of a nightmare that had been sealed away for over a decade. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs so violently it hurt. He unholstered his flashlight and stepped toward the narrow opening, peering into the absolute blackness of the cellar. But something didn't feel right. What happened next made him freeze. "Police, show me your hands," Miller yelled into the gloom, his voice booming with authority but trembling slightly with pure terror. He clicked on his high-powered tactical flashlight, cutting a brilliant, harsh beam of white light through the thick, heavy air. The light swept across the dirt floor, revealing piles of old, rotting potatoes and rusted gardening tools. But as the beam moved toward the back corner of the small, cramped space, it stopped. No one was prepared for what came next. There was a crude wooden frame built into the earth wall, a makeshift bed covered in dirty, tattered wool blankets. Sitting huddled on the edge of the frame, pressing herself as tightly as possible into the corner of the dirt wall, was a person. She was small, thin, and entirely completely pale, her skin almost translucent in the stark flashlight beam. She was wearing oversized, filthy gray sweatpants and a tattered, faded hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. Her hair was matty, long, and dark with dirt, covering most of her face. She was shaking violently, her hands covering her ears, trying to shrink away from the blinding light and the shouting men. A chill ran down Miller's spine. This wasn't the 5-year-old girl from the flyers. This was a teenager, a phantom who had grown up in the dark, but something about her didn't make sense. And then things got even stranger. Miller slowly lowered his weapon, clicking on his radio with a shaking thumb to signal a medical emergency. He took a single, slow step into the cellar, making himself as unthreatening as possible, holding up one open hand. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's okay now. We're the police. We're here to help you." The figure in the corner flinched violently at the sound of his soft voice. She slowly lowered one hand from her ear, her large, sunken eyes peering out from behind the curtain of dirty hair. She stared at him, her gaze vacant and utterly confused, as if she didn't understand the language he was speaking. She looked like a wild animal that had been trapped in a cage for its entire life, terrified of everything beyond the bars. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out, only a raspy, weak intake of breath. Miller felt a tear leak from his eye and roll down his cheek. He had been a cop for a long time, but he had never seen anything like this. But deep down, he knew something was off. That's when everything started to change. "What's your name?" Miller asked, his voice barely a whisper. The girl stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. She blinked slowly, as if processing the simple question was a monumental task for her damaged mind. Then slowly she moved her other hand, revealing something she had been clutching tightly against her stomach. It was a mass of dirty gray fur, barely recognizable as an object. But as Miller focused his light on it, his heart stopped. It was a stuffed animal. It was a rabbit with one floppy ear and a stitched nose. The identical twin to the drawing she had left at the payphone, the genuine, original Barnaby. She had carried it with her into that cellar 11 years ago, and she had never let it go. Her lips moved again, and a weak, croaking sound finally drifted into the cold air, but the reality was even darker than they thought. What came next no one expected. "Emma," she whispered, the name breaking with pain and disuse. "My name is Emma." Miller felt his knees go weak, and he had to grip the rough wooden doorframe to keep from collapsing onto the dirt floor. He had done it. He had found her. Against every conceivable statistic, against all logical hope, against 11 years of agonizing silence, Emma was alive. She was broken, scarred, and severely traumatized, but she was alive. He immediately ordered the tactical team to create a safe perimeter, calling for female officers and a specialized trauma medic to come to the shed immediately. He didn't want any more armed men in camouflage rushing into the small space, terrifying the fragile girl even further. He sat down on the dirt floor a few feet away from her, talking to her quietly about his own daughter, about the sunny sky outside, about how safe she was now, while they waited for the medical team. But something felt different that night. That's when the situation became more serious. Outside, a full police containment was in place. Half of the tactical team was now focused on the main farmhouse, waiting for Miller's command to breach. As the specialized trauma medic, a woman named Sarah with soft eyes and a gentle voice, arrived at the shed, Miller briefed her quickly. He then walked out of the cellar, stepping back into the weak morning sunlight that now filtered through the thick canopy of trees. He felt a profound sense of heavy responsibility crushing down on him. The immediate rescue was over, but the work was far from done. He looked toward the decaying farmhouse, his face hardening. He grabbed his tactical vest, tightening the straps, and signaled to the lead tactical officer. But there was one detail no one could explain. No one could have predicted what would happen next. It was time to get the monster. The team stacked up against the front door, their movement synchronizing with silent efficiency. At a single, silent nod from the team leader, the officer with the heavy battering ram swung it with full force. The wood of the front door splintered instantly, exploding inward with a deafening crash. The team flooded into the small, dark house, their weapons up, screaming commands. "Police, get down on the ground, now, now." But the expected shout of resistance, the rush of movement, or the sound of gunfire never came. The house was entirely, completely, deathly silent. The tactical team spread through the small, filthy rooms like a black tide. They found the living room filled with old newspapers and rotting food, the smell almost as foul as the cellar. They checked the kitchen, the single bathroom, the small upstairs bedroom. The whole place was a garbage dump, empty. Miller walked into the house, a confusing sense of dread settling in his gut. The dark truck with the broken taillight was parked outside under the tarp. Where was Arthur Thomas? Where was the man who had stolen a child 11 years ago and locked her in a root cellar? But something was off, really wrong. And then things got even stranger. One of the tactical officers called out from the back of the house. "Detective, in here we have movement." Miller rushed toward the small hallway leading to the back of the house. He pushed past the officers and stepped into a tiny, claustrophobic room that looked like it might have been a utility closet at some point. Sitting in the center of the room on a single, worn-out plastic chair was an old man. He was wearing a filthy, stained t-shirt and loose-fitting trousers. He was balding, his remaining gray hair stringy and dirty. He was frail, thin, and looked much older than 62. He was staring blankly at the wall opposite him, not reacting at all to the armed men who had just shattered his front door and invaded his home. His hands were clasped in his lap, shaking uncontrollably. It was Arthur Thomas, but something about the situation was profoundly disturbing. He didn't look like a vicious monster, he looked like a broken, hollow shell of a human being, but the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. No one understood the truth at that moment. Miller approached him slowly, his weapon still raised. "Arthur Thomas, you're under arrest." The old man didn't blink, he didn't turn his head. He just continued to stare at the blank wall, his lips moving silently, whispering words that no one could hear. He didn't seem to notice that Miller was speaking to him or that his house was filled with police officers. The trauma medic Sarah, who had finished her initial assessment of Emma, walked into the room at Miller's request. She approached Arthur and gently took his shaking wrist to check his pulse. She looked up at Miller with a deeply troubled expression. She said that his heart rate was extremely low and his breathing was shallow. She suspected he had taken something. Miller immediately ordered a full search of the room. On the floor behind the plastic chair, an empty bottle of prescription pain medication was lying in the dust. The label was old and faded, but the count was 0. No one imagined how this would end. That's when the story shifted completely. Arthur Thomas had made his choice. He must have known the payphone call would lead the police to him, or perhaps he just couldn't live with what he had done anymore. He had taken an overdose of the medication, deciding to end his own life rather than face the consequences of his unimaginable cruelty. Paramedics rushed into the small house, loading the frail, dying old man onto a stretcher and rushing him to an ambulance, but it was clear that it was already too late. As they wheeled him out the front door, Arthur's vacant eyes briefly locked onto Detective Miller. A single silent tear rolled down the old man's wrinkled cheek, a final sign of either remorse or terror, and then his eyes glazed over completely. He would never answer for his crimes. He would never explain why he took her, what he had done to her, or why he had kept her in the dark for 11 years. The full truth of what happened on Elm Street would die with him. But something about it didn't make sense. It just didn't. What happened after that was even more disturbing. With Arthur Thomas on his way to the hospital, where he would be pronounced dead upon arrival, the focus shifted entirely back to Emma. The trauma medic Sarah had done an amazing job of keeping Emma calm. She had wrapped Emma in several warm, clean hospital blankets and carried her out of the cellar like a child, placing her gently in the back of a specialized emergency vehicle. Emma was now sitting upright, staring out the back window with wide, unblinking eyes at the sky she hadn't seen in over a decade. She was terrified, overwhelmed, and completely silent, clutching the filthy stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. Miller knew he had to make the hardest call of his life. He walked back to his unmarked car, his body practically vibrating with exhaustion and emotional trauma. He dialed Sarah and David's home number again. He knew this call would either save them or shatter them beyond repair. But there was one detail no one could explain. No one expected what happened next. Sarah answered on the first ring, her voice almost unrecognizable with pure screaming panic. "Did you find him? Did you find her? Miller, please tell me something." Miller took a deep breath, his own voice breaking. "Sarah, we found her, she's alive, we have Emma, she's safe." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening for a moment. Then, a raw, primal scream tore through the speaker, so loud and filled with such intense, painful emotion that Miller had to pull the phone away from his ear. It was the sound of a mother's soul being pieced back together in an instant. In the background, he heard David shouting, his voice choked with sobs. Miller told them which hospital Emma was being taken to, ordered them to drive safely, and then hung up. He knew they would never be the same again. Their lives had stopped 11 years ago, and they were about to be restarted in the most complicated, painful, and beautiful way imaginable. But the reality was more complicated than it seemed. What they discovered next changed everything. By the time Miller arrived at the county hospital, a complete circus was already in progress. News trucks with satellite dishes were lining the streets, and a crowd of local residents was gathering near the entrance, whispering and pointing. The story of the century had just broken in their small, quiet town. The Elm Street girl, the ghost of a child who had vanished without a trace, had been found alive in a root cellar. Miller fought his way through the crowd of shouting reporters and into the emergency room. Hospital security had set up a strict perimeter, allowing no one near the specialized trauma ward. A female police officer stood guard at the double doors. She nodded when she saw Miller and let him through. No one knew what was about to unfold. And then something unusual caught her attention. He walked down the long, sterile hallway, the smell of antiseptic bringing back memories of 11 years of failed searches and heartbreak. In a private, secure room at the end of the hall, Sarah and David were waiting. The police hadn't let them see Emma yet, a necessary precaution to prevent further trauma for the fragile girl who might not even recognize them. They were sitting together on a small plastic bench, clinging to each other, shaking violently. When they saw Detective Miller walk through the door, they both stood up instantly, their eyes wild and raw with emotion. Sarah's face was almost unrecognizable, swollen and red from hours of hysterical crying. She looked at Miller, her lips trembling, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. What happened next shocked everyone. That's when the mystery deepened. Is it really her? Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a terrified breath. Is it really my Emma? Miller looked at the broken parents, his heart breaking for the pain they had endured and the road that still lay ahead. He didn't want to give them false hope, but the logic was absolute. He showed them the drawing Emma had made at the payphone. Sarah, you told me that only you, David, and the police knew about Barnaby, Miller said gently. She had a drawing of him at the payphone, and she was holding the actual stuffed rabbit in the cellar. Only your Emma could have that. Sarah stared at the drawing, her eyes welling with fresh tears. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the simple ink sketch of the rabbit. It was real, it was proof. She looked at David and he nodded slowly, his own face washed in absolute sorrow and relief. Miller explained that the hospital staff was currently cleaning Emma, performing a full medical evaluation and processing the profound trauma she had experienced. The reunion had to be handled with extreme care. A child who has been kept in absolute darkness, silence, and isolation for 11 years does not immediately snap back into being a normal teenager. The Emma they knew, the bright 5-year-old with curly blonde hair who loved hide-and-seek, was gone. The person waiting in that room was a stranger built from 11 years of suffering, but deep down she was still their daughter. But what really happened was hard to accept. No one knew how serious it really was. An hour later, a specialized child psychologist, Dr. Elizabeth Vance, joined them in the small waiting room. She had been assigned to the case and would be managing Emma's transition and recovery. She was calm, professional, and brutally honest with Sarah and David. She told them that Emma's development had been severely stunted. She was extremely malnourished, had zero social skills, and was terrified of bright light and loud noises. She might not remember them. She might be afraid of them. The reunion needed to be quiet, slow, and totally non-threatening. Sarah and David nodded, their faces grim, willing to do absolutely anything just to see their daughter again. But the truth had been hidden all along. And then the truth slowly began to surface. Dr. Vance finally opened the door to Emma's private hospital room. The blinds were drawn tightly, bathing the room in a soft, low, ambient light that was less triggering for her sensitive eyes. Emma was lying in the center of the large hospital bed, which looked massive compared to her tiny, frail body. She was wearing clean, white hospital scrubs. Her hair had been washed and brushed, revealing a color that was closer to a dull brown than the blonde curls she once had, though the structure of the curls was still there. She was staring at the wall, her expression vacant and still clutching the now slightly cleaner Barnaby. When the door opened, she flinched and pulled the blankets up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room in pure panic. No one was prepared for what came next. That's when everything became clear. Sarah stepped into the room first, followed closely by David and Detective Miller. Sarah did as the psychologist instructed. She didn't rush to the bed, she didn't shout Emma's name, and she didn't try to touch her. She stood a few feet away from the bed, slowly lowered herself to the floor, and sat cross-legged on the cold linoleum, making herself as unthreatening as possible. Tears streamed down her face, but she forced herself to keep her voice low and steady. No one could see what was hidden. And then things took a dark turn. "Hi, Emma," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that could melt stone. "My name is Sarah, I'm your mom, do you remember me?" Emma stared at the woman sitting on the floor. She looked at Sarah's tears, at her trembling lips, at the profound love in her eyes. Emma blinked slowly, her empty expression beginning to crack ever so slightly. A flicker of recognition, a phantom memory from 11 years ago, seemed to pass through her gaze. She sat up slowly in the bed, still pulling the blankets with her. She looked at David, who was standing behind Sarah, also crying silently. A small, weak sound came out of her throat. It wasn't Mom, and it wasn't Dad. It was a soft, whimpering sound, like a child who was waking up from a very long and very dark nightmare. But the truth changed everything. What she discovered next made her freeze. Emma slowly reached one thin, trembling hand out from under the blankets. She wasn't reaching for Sarah's hand, she was reaching for the old, worn-out drawing of Barnaby that Miller had left on the nightstand. She looked at the drawing, then she looked at the stuffed rabbit in her other arm, and then she looked back at Sarah. She swallowed, her throat dry and unused to speaking. No one expected what happened next. That's when things took a dark turn. You kept my other drawing," Emma whispered, her voice raspy, from the payphone. Sarah's heart soared, but she remained perfectly still. "Yes, Emma, we kept it. We never stopped looking for you. We were always waiting for you to come home." For the first time since she was found, Emma's vacant eyes filled with clear, unmistakable emotion. Her lower lip began to tremble, and she slowly lowered her head, the heavy mat of hair hiding her face. A single quiet sob escaped from her, followed by another and then another. The dam finally broke. 11 years of fear, silence, and isolation came pouring out in a flood of tears. Sarah slowly moved from the floor to the edge of the bed, moving inch by inch until she was sitting right next to her daughter. She opened her arms, waiting, still not daring to touch her. Emma paused for a second, then collapsed into her mother's embrace, burying her face against Sarah's chest and sobbing with a raw, primal pain that tore through the quiet hospital room. Sarah held her, wrapping her arms around the broken girl, sobbing herself, breathing in the scent of her daughter for the first time in a decade. David dropped to his knees next to the bed, reaching out to touch Emma's shaking arm, adding his own hands to the tight, healing knot of his family. No one knew how long they cried. They were finally together again. The nightmare was over. The miracle had happened. They had their daughter back, but the reality was that nothing would ever be the same again. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. What they recovered was deeply unsettling. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Emma remained in the specialized trauma ward for over a month. Psychologists and trauma specialists worked with her every single day, slowly introducing her to light, sound, other people, and the overwhelming concept of the outside world. Sarah and David never left her side, sleeping in rotating shifts on a pull-out couch in her hospital room. Sarah quit her job as a nurse immediately, dedicating her life entirely to her daughter's recovery. David took an extended leave of absence from the bank. Money, social life, and the outside world ceased to exist for them. Their universe had shrunk down to the four walls of that hospital room, where they were slowly, painstakingly rebuilding a human soul from the ashes of unimaginable trauma. But deep down, she knew something was off. That's when the story shifted completely. As Emma stabilized, the focus of the investigation turned to the late Arthur Thomas. Detectives and state police units practically tore his decaying farmhouse apart. They found things that confirmed the depths of his sickness, things that would require years of specialized therapy for Emma to even begin to process. They found evidence from dozens of other small-time burglaries in the area, but no definitive link to any other missing children. It seemed that Emma was his only living victim, his dark, secret obsession that he had guarded in that root cellar for over a decade. The truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. The fact that he was dead, unable to be questioned or punished, was a source of immense anger and frustration for Detective Miller and the community. But the reality was that Emma was alive, and that was the only victory that mattered. But there was something strange about it. No one recognized what was coming. When Emma was finally discharged, the family didn't return to the small house on Elm Street. Sarah and David knew they could never live in that house again, surrounded by the shadows of that back gate and the walking path. They packed up their belongings in secret, selling the house through an agent to avoid the inevitable media attention. They bought a small, secluded farmhouse far away, surrounded by acres of quiet land and miles of fencing, similar to the property where Emma had been held, but this time it was built from safety and love instead of fear and isolation. They were effectively in hiding, disappearing from the public eye to let Emma heal in peace. A chill ran down her spine. Nothing made sense anymore. And then something unexpected happened. The road to recovery was, and still is, incredibly long. Emma struggled with severe agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces. She often refused to leave her bedroom, only feeling safe when surrounded by four solid walls. She suffered from terrible nightmares and would wake up screaming, thinking she was back in the dirt cellar. It took 2 full years before she could walk to the front porch by herself, and another year after that before she could handle being in a room with a large group of people. She had to learn everything: how to socialize, how to use modern technology, how to trust other people. She had missed her entire childhood. She had missed middle school, high school, her first crush, her first dance. She had been frozen in time at 5 years old, forced to grow into a teenager within the body of a wild animal. But she was Emma. She was strong. She had survived. That's when everything started to change. No one knew how serious it really was. Years passed, and the media attention slowly faded, replaced by other news stories and fresh tragedies. The story of the Elm Street girl became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale that parents whispered to their children to make them stay close. Detective Miller stayed in touch with Sarah and David, visiting the family once a year, always bringing a small gift for Emma. He was promoted to captain of the Criminal Investigation Division, but the file on Emma's case remained on his desk as a constant reminder that miracles do happen, even in the darkest corners of the world. What happened next shocked everyone. A decade later, on a peaceful autumn day much like the one when she disappeared, Emma, now a young woman of 26, stood on the porch of the secluded farmhouse. Her hair now cut short in a healthy, vibrant shade of brown blew in the wind. She was still clutching Barnaby, who was now so old and tattered he was practically falling apart, but she refused to let him go. She looked out over the open fields, taking a long, deep breath of the cold air. Her parents were inside, preparing dinner, the sound of their soft conversation and laughter drifting through the open window. It was a picture of a normal life. It was a life built from pain, rebuilt from love, and defined by resilience. Nothing made sense anymore, but for the first time in her life it didn't have to. She was safe, she was loved, she was free. That's when the story shifted completely. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. The case of Emma leaves us with a powerful and unsettling truth. We want to believe the world is a simple place, filled with clear lines between good and evil, but the reality is much more complicated. Evil often doesn't wear a mask. It wears the face of your neighbor, your service worker, or an old man staring at a wall. We have to be vigilant, not just for ourselves, but for each other. Sarah and David spent 11 years waiting, their faith and love the only lights in a universe that had gone entirely dark. Their reward was not a complete recovery, but a complicated and messy healing, the return of a phantom who had to learn how to be a person again. Their story teaches us that hope, no matter how fragile, can survive the deepest darkness. That love, no matter how fractured, can mend the most broken souls. But the most important lesson is to never, ever stop looking for the truth, even when it seems impossible. Even when the world tells you to move on. Because sometimes, against all logic and probability, the lost do come home, and that's when the real healing begins. And that's when the story really matters. But the truth was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. It changed everything. Forever.